Good evening, everyone. Hello, my name is Gary Waltham. I'm Chief Executive of RCOT, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you this evening to our prestigious 2026 Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecture. Absolutely fantastic that we can all get together online for this very special event, and it's truly fantastic to have so many of you joining us tonight. We have over 1,800 people sign up to join, which is just incredible. Thank you for being here. Just a short introduction from me and a few housekeeping bits, and then we'll go to the reason why you're all here. Let me just start with some thanks. An awful lot of effort goes into organising this event, and my thanks to the RCOT events team, and particularly Kaz Dunn, who works so hard to bring everything together to run this evening's event successfully. Thank you, Kaz and the events team. Now, although we may not be able to see each other this evening face to face, you can use the chat tab to connect with one another. And you can also, if you wish to submit any questions to our Casson lecturer this evening, we will be having a short Q&A later on in this evening, and you can use the questions tab to submit any questions that you may have. A little bit of background. This annual lecture was first held in 1973, and that was in honour of Dr. Elizabeth Casson and her contributions to the occupational therapy profession. Dr. Casson was the first woman to be awarded a medical degree, and that was from the University of Bristol in 1919. Dr. Casson introduced occupational therapy to England, and in 1929 she established the first occupational therapy school, Dorset House in Bristol. In recognition of Dr. Elizabeth Casson's commitment to further occupational therapy, RCOT award this lecturership to a member whose peers consider them to have made or indeed be making a significant contribution to the profession's development. And our lecture is an opportunity for the chosen speaker to talk about a topic important to them and important to the profession of occupational therapy. So that's it from me. I hope you enjoy this evening's lecture. Thank you again for joining us this evening. And I'd now like to invite Laura de Bonner as the nominator of tonight's lecturer to introduce our 2026 Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturer. Thank you, Laura.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to have the privilege of introducing the 2026 Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturer, the inspirational and influential Sue Parkinson. In introducing Sue, I'm introducing a colleague whose work has shaped, strengthened, and in many ways redefined occupation-centred practice within our profession. Sue Parkinson has dedicated her career to ensuring that the heart of occupational therapy, our commitment to meaningful activity and participation, remains visible, defensible, and deeply understood. From her early days as an occupational therapist in mental health services to her role as a practice development advisor in Derbyshire and a freelance national and international trainer and beyond, Sue consistently champions theory-driven, evidence-based, occupation-focused practice. Many of us here have been guided by the resources she created to meet the real needs of clinicians and to help us explain our role to our service users and colleagues, educating them all in the powerful role occupation has on health. The MOHO, translated into 18 languages, transformed how we document and articulate occupational participation. Sue's Recovery Through Activity programme, now in its second edition and used widely across the UK and beyond, reminds us of the transformative power of activity in identity, well-being and recovery. And her textbook on formulation and goal setting has helped countless practitioners speak clearly, confidently and proudly in our own occupational language. In all her work, Sue distills the complexity of occupation into commonly understood terms and easy to use outcome measures and programs. Sue has enabled us occupational therapists to explain and evidence the impact of our work and of occupation and activity to our service users, multidisciplinary colleagues, and when needed, to ourselves. I first read Sue's work in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy over 25 years ago. That work prompted me to apply to work with her in Derbyshire. I had no idea then how much of an impression and positive influence on my life Sue would be, both personally and professionally. I am one of the many who she has impacted and supported to become a better occupational therapist than I would otherwise have been. Sue is widely respected by those who work with her. She brings a compassionate yet intellectual approach to all things occupational therapy. She remains curious about the work of all occupational therapists and has infectious enthusiasm for articulating the benefits of what we do. Sue's influence extends far beyond her numerous publications. As a trainer, mentor, and global educator, she has inspired thousands of occupational therapists to think deeply, practice authentically, and remain grounded in the values that define our profession. Her work continually challenges the status quo, offering tools that counterbalance dominant medical and psychological narratives and place occupation where it belongs, at the centre of our interventions and at the core of the stories and the people we work with. Sue also lives by her values and principles, developing tools such as the MOHO on a not-for-profit basis, incorporating awareness of our environment into our practice, be that socio-political, physical, or in terms of sustainability. These values are embodied in her personal self too. Whether tending to her allotment or supporting people who are refugees with their English language acquisition, Sue can always be found using her acknowledged privilege to engage in activity that makes a positive contribution to the world. I hope this brief overview of some of Sue's achievements and impact on us and those we work for suggests why she is so deserving of this lecture. By the end of the lecture, you will be in no doubt of why she was chosen. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our incredibly intelligent, impactful and inspiring colleague, the 2026 Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturer, Sue Parkinson.
Hello. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the RCOT, the Royal College of Occupational Therapists, for inviting me to give this lecture, and all the occupational therapists who have supported me over the years, including my colleagues from Derbyshire. I'm aware that this opportunity is an enormous privilege. Unlike many of the lecturers in earlier years, I'm not an academic. Having said that, I am, and I probably always will be, a bit of a geek, a model of human occupation geek. And so I am delighted to have this chance to share my thoughts with you. My lecture may not be based on a research study, but it is based on what I have found to work in practice in services here in the UK. Whether the same things work for you or not is for you to decide. And before I go any further, you may have noticed that I'll be using one of the simplest fonts on my slides. It seems to have fallen out of favour in recent years, but when I started to teach English to asylum seekers, I gained a renewed appreciation of its simplicity. So why do I want to focus on simplicity? Well, perhaps because of my Quaker heritage and the Quaker values of simplicity, equality, truth and peace, and how they relate to one another. The Quaker advice, a simple lifestyle freely chosen is a source of strength, has always inspired me. Or perhaps because before I trained as an occupational therapist, I studied social anthropology, which helped me to appreciate diversity, but also made me more aware of the simple universal factors which influence all our lives. For me, social anthropology paved the way for applying the model of human occupation. And just maybe it's to provide an alternative viewpoint to the customary focus on occupational therapy as a complex intervention. I would never deny that occupational therapy is complex. I've just become much more interested in how occupational therapists who are experts at simplifying the lives of the people they work with can manage the complexity of their own practice. It was when I was nominated to give this lecture that I realised just how much I've tried to make occupation-centred practice simpler and easier to sustain. When I was developing the MOHO screening tool, I wrote that I wanted to create a simple outcome measure using commonly understood terms. And when I was writing about occupational formulation, I wanted to communicate complex matters that are of fundamental importance with as much clarity and simplicity as I could. And my hope for the Recovery Through Activity programme was that it would provide a flexible resource. And then when I was asked to give this lecture, I looked at what previous Casson lecturers from the last 20 years have had to say on simplicity and inevitably on complexity. And there's plenty to share with you. I hope that Elizabeth Casson would have approved this focus. Did you know her family knew her quite simply as Elsie? And in her early career as a doctor, she recognised that inpatients in a mental health setting were bored, and she noticed a dramatic change when they were involved in making simple Christmas decorations. As Annie Turner said in her reflections on giving the memorial lecture, the core concept isn't rocket science. It isn't. The ideas behind occupational therapy are very simple. And yet, as Jenny Preston said in her lecture, Dr. Casson's holistic, communal and participatory model anticipated contemporary occupational therapy practice. Where did her ideas come from? Annie Turner described how before Elizabeth trained as a doctor, she worked for the well-known social reformer Octavia Hill, who was a Unitarian. Interestingly, although my parents both became Quakers, my mother came from a long line of Unitarians. And like Elsie, if I can call her that, my mum was brought up with liberal values, and she recognised the crucial importance of the environment and the positive impact of arts and crafts. My mum became an occupational therapist, and I followed in her footsteps. In order to share my thoughts and experiences about simplicity and occupational therapy with you, I have split what I want to say into two simple halves. The first half focuses on managing complexity, or even better, finding the simplicity in complexity, a wonderful phrase used by Diane Cox in her lecture. I'll be reflecting on how the model of human occupation, MOHO, was designed to manage complexity. That said, I want to assure you, just like Keir Harding stressed in his lecture, that other opinions and other models are available. In the second half, I'll be focusing on promoting sustainability and sharing aspects of my work which aimed to simplify the occupational therapy process, assessment, planning and intervention, so that occupation-centred practice is simpler or easier to sustain. And throughout this lecture, I want to honour the people I cite by using their full names. So, managing complexity. What is so complex about occupational therapy? Kathleen Reid and Sharon Sanderson, two women whose names are so often reduced to Reid and Sanderson, observed that occupational therapy is rooted in everyday occupations, suggesting a certain simplicity. After all, everyday occupations are ordinary, perhaps even mundane. Yet, despite commonplace occupations like art or cooking, using simple everyday tools, it's possible to create phenomenal works of art and culinary masterpieces. In the same way, the tools of occupational therapy might seem unremarkable, but they help people to recreate themselves, and as we know, they can achieve extraordinary results. This leads me to counter any suggestion that the basis of occupational therapy is simple, by asserting that the basis of occupational therapy is fundamental. It's one of my favourite words, fundamental. Also, I have a memory of a postcard which was produced to celebrate Occupational Therapy Week, I think by the College of Occupational Therapists, as it was known then. In my mind, it showed a picture of someone tying their shoelaces and a caption which made it clear that so-called simple occupations are only simple if you can do them. So although the concept of occupational therapy may be simple and the tools may be simple, we can refute any suggestion that occupational therapy is simple. Another response would be the paradox of occupational therapy is that it is both simple and complex. In the 4th edition of Occupational Therapy Performance, Participation and Wellbeing, we are invited to think of occupations as being both beautiful in their simplicity and amazing in their complexity. So true. Catherine Reed and Sharon Sanderson wrote about how promoting the doing of everyday things can be simple, but understanding how the doing affects health and well-being over a person's lifetime is far from simple. Frustratingly, as Annie Turner and Aldine Alsop realised, this understanding, which is central to the unique core skills of occupational therapists, is largely hidden. It is too often locked away in your professional reasoning skills and invisible to others. As for the more obvious practice skills, they're hugely diverse depending on the various settings you work in, and they may appear simple, while the complex professional reasoning skills which unite occupational therapy practice can go unnoticed by your nearest colleagues. The challenge is to make these complex reasoning skills more widely recognised. And some of you may remember a series of articles in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy, BJOT, about occupational therapy as a complex intervention. Or perhaps you saw the update written in 2018, or listened to a series of lectures about the complexity of occupation, which is still available on the RCOT website. Although it's not my intention to provide an overview of their content, suffice to say that I agree with Eddie Duncan and his colleagues that complexity is not something to be particularly proud of if it means that occupational therapy outcomes are unpredictable, or that it is impossible to have standardised interventions. In fact, and I quote, "The critical mistake is to assume that because the behaviour of the system as a whole is complex, it cannot be explained and understood by studying how the parts interact." Before moving on to how we can understand this complexity, I thought it'd be interesting to look at how often the words complex and complexity have been used in the Casson lectures from the last 20 years featured in BJOT. Here's a graph of the last 10 lectures to be published in the journal, and you can see that the 7 most recently published lectures have all referred to complexity, with the references peaking first in 2017 when Diane Cox talked about complex occupations requiring complex interventions, and again in 2019 when Sarah Kantatsis spoke about fostering the potential of occupation and occupational therapy in a complex world. Simplicity also features in the lectures, although not to the same extent. Although I'll be mentioning simple or simplicity 78 times in this lecture, so I think I'll be redressing the balance. In addition to Diane Cox's theme of simplicity in complexity, Alison Hammond mentioned work simplification. Wendy Bryant described how participation in a simple game is usually engaging, and Therese Jackson talked of simple ideas and solutions having a big impact. These references to simplicity are all positive, and they represent the simplicity which I associate with occupational therapy, grading interventions to make things simpler for people. This leads me to believe that the ability of occupational therapists to simplify things for the people they work with is a superpower. And if occupational therapy appears simple, this is something to be celebrated. I'm reminded of this quote by Ernst Schumacher. "Any intelligent fool can make things bigger, more complex, and more violent. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction." I like to think that occupational therapy has a touch of genius, and I'm sure many of us believe, like Mary Ann McCall, that if one truly understands something, then one can communicate it simply and effectively. Mary Ann has described how theories help practitioners to communicate simply and effectively, helping you to communicate your professional reasoning. And it's because they satisfy 8 important functions. Simplifying things is at the top of her list. She recognises that theory simplifies the world around us into the subset of factors or concepts that we are most interested in. It reduces the number of factors we must consider to a reasonable few, thus allowing us to examine them in detail and to understand their relationship to other members of a subset. Well said, Marianne. In many ways, these theoretical factors and concepts provide us with a reminder of things to take note of, and occupational therapists are not the only profession to benefit from reminders. For example, surgeons are much less likely to leave swabs and instruments inside a patient's body when a checklist is kept. Who knew? And when Therese Jackson gave her Casson lecture, she commented on how countless practitioners in the UK benefited from the campaign to introduce ourselves with the phrase, "Hello, my name is," and she described it as such a simple idea. I believe that by making things simple and sustainable, we make our lives more sustainable, and I mean that in the eco sense of the word. But I also believe that when professional practice is clearer, easier, more straightforward, best practice becomes more sustainable in terms of being viable, feasible, and verifiable. Also, when things are simple and sustainable, your practice becomes more consistent. It becomes easier to share your practice, allowing greater consistency across services. So, by unifying aspects of your professional practice, you make it simpler and more sustainable for everyone to support each other, to share key resources, and excitingly, to draw on larger pools of data for research purposes. More than this, it can help the multidisciplinary team and the general public to take notice of and to recognise the shared core function of occupational therapy, instead of noticing the multitude of different individual things that occupational therapists will continue to do in different services. Naturally, my opinions have been influenced by Gary Kielhofner and his work to develop the MOHO. Like my dad, Gary was a conscientious objector, and just like my dad, he was first introduced to occupational therapy while working in a hospital as an alternative to military service. In my dad's case, he worked at the Retreat Hospital, which was founded by a Quaker, William Tuke, and was the first mental health asylum to provide humane treatment. While my dad fell in love with an occupational therapist, my mum, Gary, fell in love with occupational therapy. To use a phrase from last year's Casson lecture by Charlie Chung, Gary went on to hold the door open for me and for many others across the world. The first letter I received from him following an inquiry on my part ended with an astonishing invitation to collaborate. He continued to endorse scholarships of practice and believed that while theory might inform practice, practitioners can change theory by raising questions to be addressed and creating new tools and assessments. I now agree wholeheartedly with Annette Jewston that evidence-based occupational therapy models are essential to occupation-centred practice. She wrote that they provide an organisational structure to reduce personal bias and provide occupational therapists with the appropriate language to communicate, document, and act on the complex evidence and professional process of conceptual problem solving and planning. Wise words indeed. Now, like all models, the MOHO requires reflection and active use of the concepts, because all models depend on how they are implemented. Gary himself acknowledged the importance of understanding the limits of MOHO. It is worth noting, however, that this hasn't always reassured everybody, including Casson lecturers. For example, 10 years ago, Wendy Bryant admitted that models can be useful to bring people together and promote an occupational perspective, which I agree with. But when writing about her experiences as a Casson lecturer, she described being perennially anxious about imposing theoretical frameworks and concepts on experiences, something one should never do. And 20 years ago, in his lecture, Graham Smith suggested that models gave an illusion of certainty and said, I get the impression that the older generation of occupational therapists were not constrained by theory. They understood the power and the passion of activity, and they just did it. Elizabeth Casson, though not an occupational therapist herself, was undeniably one such person. A family member described her as being a determined lady who nearly always got her own way because it never occurred to her that any sensible person would disagree with her. But even though we can try, and we must try, to be more Elizabeth, we can't all be an Elizabeth Casson. I know I can't, just as I often find it challenging to lead a lifestyle that is truly simple. I have learnt by experience just how difficult it is to remain occupation-centred with competing pressures in today's health and social care services. I'm also assured that there was never a golden age of occupational therapy. In fact, the MOHO was partly inspired by Gary's experience of the profession becoming mechanistic and lacking meaning. As things stand, the tide of opinion appears to have well and truly turned, with more and more occupational therapists supporting the practical utility offered by conceptual models of practice to manage the complexity of professional reasoning, including an increasing number of Casson lecturers. Inga Warren was overwhelmingly positive about the MOHO, declaring that it was Gary Kielhofner's work that switched on the light that has been burning brightly ever since. You and me both, Inga. And Claire Ballinger stated that we now have a plethora of occupational therapy models of practice to which we can turn when challenged with, so what is it that occupational therapists do again? And next, Elaine Hunter cited an article about the application of the MOHO when she confirmed that new ways of working can be implemented successfully. And it was noticeable, to me at least, that both Keir Harding in 2023 and Charlie Chung last year chose to refer to the MOHO rather than any other model. So, although some people might fear that models oversimplify things, and students, I know, especially when they first learn about the MOHO, sometimes think that it's too complicated. I tend to agree once more with Mary Ann McCall, when her writing style was critiqued for being both too simplistic and too complex. She suspected that she'd got it just right. In order to be clinically useful, the MOHO is both simple and complex. At its simplest, it has just 4 elements: volition or motivation for occupation, habituation or pattern of occupation, performance capacity, which is often related to health conditions, all in a dynamic relationship with the environment. It was when I was on my first maternity leave that I truly understood the interaction between these elements and how they affected me. And I'd like to thank Keir Harding for allowing me to copy his slide in which the me in environment is highlighted. On maternity leave, both my physical environment and my social environment were more restricted, forcing me to find new outlets. Sleepless nights affected my capacity, but I was also finding new ways to cope. My roles and routines changed dramatically, as one might imagine, and I experienced a major shift in my volition. My sense of my own competence was tested big time, but the things that I valued became even more important. It was evident that MOHO theory applied to me and applies to us all. It's not just a model which is applicable in a health or social care setting. I am convinced that it deals with simple truths. And when I returned to work, the model reinforced my belief that a person doesn't just interact in the environment, but with the environment. as a consequence, the moment you step into a person's social environment, you are capable of changing that environment, and with it, the capacity, the habituation, and the volition of that individual. These 4 elements make such sense, and yet they aren't enough on their own for a true conceptual model. A model has interactive parts like this, but it also has to have depth, and the MOHO does. Take the single element of volition. The complexity increases in a managed way the deeper we delve into it. We can divide it into 3 main components: personal causation, values, and interest, and each of these can be subdivided. And then there are 14 observable volitional items to evaluate in the volitional questionnaire, as well as multiple steps, strategies, and interventions in the remotivation process. Don't take my word for it. I recommend familiarising yourself with these tools. When I was supervising students or new colleagues like Laura de Bonner, who nominated me to give this lecture, I used to ask them, how do you know that someone's volition is increasing? Have a think about someone who has low volition. What do you notice? What do you observe? Most people never got beyond mentioning something about body language. But when I asked Laura, she could name 11 intentional actions straight away because she was familiar with the volitional questionnaire. I was impressed. And since then, it has been my privilege to work with many incredible occupational therapists like Laura and Gary and Carmen de las Heras to make it simpler to apply MOHO theory across the whole of the occupational therapy process, whether this involves assessment and successive evaluations, of course, planning or intervention. Oh, we're halfway through the lecture now. Take a moment to make sure that you're comfortable, and we'll continue. Okay, let's look at how complexity can be managed in the occupational therapy process in a way that promotes sustainability. Let's think about how resources can make the process simpler and more sustainable while creating opportunities for building on the evidence base of the profession. We'll start with the assessment process because occupational assessment provides the foundation for occupation-centred practice. I was drawn to the MOHO and its collection of assessments, partly because I wanted to be able to communicate my findings simply, clearly, and logically, and to provide evidence for these findings. It turns out that the evidence is one of 3 elements of persuasion, according to Aristotle. I was reminded of this when reading an article by Tricia Greenhalgh and her colleagues about a values-informed approach to complexity in healthcare. But even without knowing anything about Aristotle, the importance of having the evidence is, well, it's evident. If we look to earlier Casson lectures, we can see that Elaine Hunter talked about the importance of a focus on measuring outcomes and impact, while Sydney Chu emphasised the importance of selecting and applying qualitative and quantitative outcome measures. In addition, Daniel Cesar de Cruz, in his RCOT lecture about occupation and complexity, went so far as to state, your practice is evidence-based when you use an outcome measure or conceptual model that is widely researched. And that's one of the MOHO's selling points. As it happens, I've thought a great deal over the course of my career about how to make MOHO assessments and outcome measures simpler and easier to sustain in practice. Just for example, I created a self-assessment version of the work environment impact scale so that my colleagues could rate their opportunities for practice development without my involvement. I developed a version of the residential environment impact scale that could be used as a home assessment. And I led the development of the research version of the MOHO exploratory level outcome ratings, the MOHO Explore, which allowed the complex occupational needs of people living with profound learning disabilities or advanced dementia to be captured in a single comprehensive assessment. I am generally known, however, as an author of the MOHO screening tool, the MOHOst. This is partly because I worked as a freelance trainer for 20 years, initially teaching the MOHOst alongside my NHS work, helping practitioners to sustain their application of the MOHO. I was lucky enough to build relationships with many therapists over consecutive years, such as the fabulous occupational therapists in Northern Ireland. And I'm pleased to say that a group of occupational therapists in Belfast have been organising their own MOHO fests to celebrate their progress since then. I drafted my first ideas of what became the MOHOst on my second maternity leave. I wanted a comprehensive assessment for people who couldn't tolerate an interview or a self-assessment. One which was based simply on getting to know the person. And one that was relatively quick to complete because my job was in a fast-paced acute mental health unit. Eventually, this led to the current version of the MOHOst with a full instruction manual and extended criteria. But I was keen to make some significant changes to the actual assessment form to make it simpler for practitioners to complete the assessment. Simple, everyday language was used as much as possible. Key concepts and key criteria were added to the form itself so that all the information was in one place. The FAIR scale, F-A-I-R, was developed. Facilitates, allows, inhibits, restricts, to guide the rating process. And I also created a single observation form allowing occupational therapy assistants to contribute to the assessment process. The MOHOst is far from perfect. I doubt if it is possible to have a perfect assessment, but it does provide a flexible way for practitioners to gather information. It has proved to be a valid assessment of occupational participation, and it can be used with a wide ability range. It has been, frankly, amazing to see it being used for research purposes. For example, to develop occupational therapy indicative care packages, and great to have a national survey confirm its value. It's also been exciting to see occupational therapists in the UK, such as John Puddle, who contributed to the 6th edition of the MOHO textbook, devising ways to collate MOHO's data to evaluate the effectiveness of their services. After assessment comes planning. But in order to plan, practitioners need to make sure they've understood all the information they've gathered. And this involves synthesizing the information from the assessment stage. Unfortunately, too many occupational therapists have taken the MOHOst ratings and built lengthy reports around them, which list all the separate items, all 24. A better alternative would be to craft a formulation. This is a way in which complex professional reasoning can be converted into a narrative, a simple story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it's encouraging to see that the importance of narrative has been raised by several highly respected Casson lecturers. Nick Pollard spoke at length about the power of narratives to develop a shared view of complex situations. In addition, Diane Cox shared her experience of using narrative practice to enable people to tell their stories, while Elaine Hunter urged occupational therapists to find effective ways of integrating a person's narrative into a strategic vision. Interestingly, Aristotle realized that another element in the art of persuasion requires us to appeal to a person's emotions. And narrative has this superb ability to combine an appeal to reason and logic with an appeal to the emotions. Linda Finley, who taught me at the College of Ripon, New York, St. John back in the 80s, wrote a critical analysis of an occupational narrative, published in BJOT. And it started with a quote from the 3rd edition of the MOHO textbook, stating that narrative is both the meaning we assign to occupational life and the medium through which we enact it. In this same edition, Gary and his colleagues proposed that a person's narrative is formed around their sense of occupational identity and their sense of occupational competence. And in the 5th edition, readers were shown an option for summarising this narrative in an occupational formulation. Over time, I refined how I taught this, trying to make the process simpler for occupational therapists by focusing on a 3-part structure. I recommend that, first of all, the occupational identity section focuses on people's subjective viewpoint, their volitional perspective regarding their roles and relationships, the key changes in their lives, including the changes in the physical and social environment, and their interests and goals. After that, the second part of the formulation, occupational competence, focuses on an objective account of how their routines, skills, performance, and current environment match their identity. My experiences led to me writing a guide to the formulation of plans and goals in occupational therapy with Rob Brooks. And some of you might have noticed that the image I've used on my slides is a simplified image of the one on the cover of the book. The popularity of this book undoubtedly had a role to play in securing the inclusion of occupational formulation in the current enhanced clinical practice education curriculum for occupational therapists in England. Rob and I continue to support one another in our efforts to make sure that the practice of occupational formulation is sustained. And we've been joined in our mini scholarship of practice by Lisa Jameson in Scotland and Lorraine Maynard in Australia. With Lisa providing training, Lorraine publishing her doctoral research, and Rob starting to supervise PhD students who are researching occupational formulation, the future of this bit of the OT planning process is in safe hands. In the meantime, even if you're not confident about your ability to craft a formulation, or even if you only have time to formulate in your head, if you can identify the 3rd part of an occupational formulation, the key occupational needs of a person, you can make occupational therapy plans so much clearer by negotiating person-centred, measurable goals. When reviewing past lectures, it was marvellous to find that Sydney Chu encouraged collaborative goal setting, and to read that Diane Cox formulated narratives, fed them back, and then reformulated them to make sure that everyone was working towards the same goal. Even more inspiring was reading Therese Jackson's account of how she introduced goal setting to a stroke rehabilitation unit, which reduced the median length of stay to 28 days, compared to 55 days at an alternative service, saving approximately, wait for it, £19,000 per admission. These results are all the more mind-blowing, given that writing measurable goals has been notoriously difficult. Sydney Chu, like many people before him, emphasised the importance of writing SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. But although the SMART acronym describes the qualities of a goal, it doesn't provide you with a structure for writing goals. So I developed the TICS system, TICKS, a simple mnemonic to describe how to piece a goal together. My light bulb moment came when reading the 4th edition of the MOHO textbook and learning about how clients achieve change. Once you've agreed the long-term needs, the key needs in a formulation, you can negotiate the change expected over the short term. For example, to explore different options, to identify strengths and limitations, or to practice the necessary skills. After this, you can name the individual who is responsible for achieving the goal and clarify the supports to help that person achieve the necessary changes. And it's so much simpler to agree a realistic time frame. For example, within the next week, that's the time frame, Sue Parkinson, the individual concerned, will re-examine her experiences, that's the change expected, as a Casson lecturer, that's my main goal, with the loving support of her family, all the support I need. This simple TICS framework has since been adopted by Public Health Wales, which is a fantastic accolade for the occupational therapy profession. After planning comes intervention, and I have a particular passion for group interventions. This started before I trained as an occupational therapist when I worked in a Quaker peace initiative. It was here that I learned how to facilitate workshops in which participants could support each other to connect with their beliefs, in this case in peace and non-violence, without being told what they should think, without being lectured. I now count myself as a humanist, a stance which aligns perfectly with occupational therapy according to Wikipedia. It emphasises the individual and social potential and agency of human beings, and stresses the importance of morality and practical action to provide meaning and shape to our lives. So many phrases which resonate with OT philosophy. Having this connection with your core beliefs means that you should already possess the third element of persuasion, according to Aristotle: ethical or moral credibility. I see a tremendous amount of understanding regarding the need to be person-centred and occupation-centred. I see ethical practice where the values of practitioners align with the people they work with. And I see a huge amount of trust between both parties. However, building credibility can still be improved by basing interventions on credible sources and by speaking with one voice. Once more, looking at past lectures, it is clear I am not alone in wanting to see packages of interventions which can be implemented easily by teams of occupational therapists. Diane Cox made a compelling case for producing manuals and guidance, while Katrina Bannigan described her ongoing work to develop a new health promotion manual based on the fantastic Do Live Well framework. My contribution so far has been to produce a flexible programme called Recovery Through Activity, which I'm happy to report has been translated into Italian, German and French. It is now in its second edition with updated literature sections by some terrific occupational therapists from Coventry University, as well as improved key messages and session ideas. The idea, as ever, is to make it simpler for practitioners to sustain their occupation-centred practice. Recovery Through Activity has already helped occupational therapists across the UK and Ireland return to their occupational roots. And a second volume, Discovery Through Activity, showcases examples of occupational therapists applying, adapting and extending the programme in a variety of services. And it gives details of 12 videos on YouTube which introduce the 12 topics of Recovery Through Activity. The very first chapters in Discovery Through Activity describe how occupational therapists in Aneurin Bevan University Health Board in Wales have adopted it and embedded it service-wide. Their work allowed them to host a PhD study by Savannah Cole at Cardiff University, which just goes to show that the publication of occupational interventions is a step in building the evidence base and demonstrating value. That's a phrase included in the foreword of the first edition of Recovery Through Activity by the magnificent Mary Morley, as my husband calls her, and another Mary, Mary Birkin. What you may or may not know is that I've been working on a new intervention handbook, which is due to be published very soon now at the end of May. It's called Maintaining Our Health Through Occupation. And if you recognise some of the initials in the name, MOHTO, that's because it's about maintaining our health through the conscious application of the MOHO. Whereas Recovery Through Activity is occupation-focused and occupation-based and aims to strengthen an emerging sense of efficacy, Maintaining Our Health Through Occupation is occupation-focused and discussion-based. It takes things to the next level of the remotivation process by strengthening a sense of responsibility and autonomy. Otherwise, it's very much like Recovery Through Activity in that it's a flexible resource with a range of simple, practical ideas. In addition to providing a structure for group interventions and a prompt for meaningful conversations with individuals, Laura de Bonner realised that it can also be used as a resource for teaching students about the MOHO while simultaneously enabling them to practice group facilitation skills. And she already has a plan in place to pilot this option. The motto has 7 topics: following our values, developing our roles, establishing our routines, pursuing our interests, protecting our physical environment, strengthening our social connections, and boosting our confidence, which is just a simpler way of saying boosting our personal causation. And it's been piloted by some brilliant occupational therapists in Sussex Partnership NHS Foundation Trust, another trust which has worked to embed recovery through activity across its services. Their evaluations from 5 separate facilities feature in the new handbook. My decision to start the programme with a session about values was based on the importance that values have for the choices people make. If it seems like a brave choice, perhaps a little bit too personal to start with, then perhaps this epitomises the humanist values which underpin occupational therapy, which Elizabeth Betty Yerxa, once described as audacious values. Audacious values, isn't that marvellous? The pilot confirmed that this was the right choice. A couple of the occupational therapists in Sussex commented that we rarely had space in our day-to-day work to have in-depth conversations with people about their values and viewpoints. And that's rather sad. I imagine that Anita Atwell, another Casson lecturer, would also be saddened by this, as she described wanting occupational therapists to truly understand the people they work with. I own that another topic in this new programme, protecting our physical environment, pushes the boundaries of occupational therapy. I said at the beginning of this lecture that I mean simplicity and sustainability in the eco sense of the word, as well as the simplicity and sustainability of occupation-centred practice. The model of human occupation has always recognised the dynamic interaction between individuals and their environments, and it has described how the global social environment has an impact on us according to the prevailing economic conditions, as well as cultural attitudes and political decisions of the day. And in the 5th edition of the MOHO textbook, I played a part in ensuring that the global impact of geography, ecology, and the climate is addressed in the physical environment in MOHO theory. I was influenced by the many occupational therapists who have been calling on their profession to tackle this topic, including Casson lecturer Sarah Kantatsis, who noted that occupational therapists see the fundamental importance of how we live our lives to the well-being of the planet. And it turned out that an occupational therapy student who was involved in piloting the programme need not have hesitated about the topic being too political, as it became a favourite topic in her group. The pilot confirmed that the programme allows occupational therapists to broach the subjects which are important for maintaining health and well-being and that are really important for the people they work with. Ultimately, when reviewing the topic, I came to the following conclusions. Environmental sustainability is vital for long-term health and well-being. Environmental choices are essential for sustainable lifestyles. Environmental action can be a source of meaning. Environmental awareness must be factored in to occupational interventions. Of course, including any of the topics in maintaining our health through occupation will always be a matter of choice, ideally informed by co-production. But when considering whether a topic is political or not, we must bear in mind that the very act of occupational therapy and the pursuit of occupational justice can be said to be political. As Nick Pollard stated in his lecture, occupational therapy practice involves working with the consequences of health inequity, And the rapid changes we are experiencing in our global physical environment are increasing health inequity and having a direct impact on everyone's lives. This brings me back full circle to thinking about my values of simplicity, equality, truth, and peace, and brings me to the end of this lecture. In conclusion, models of practice are not a substitute for professional reasoning. Professional reasoning is complex, but adopting a model of practice can help you to manage that complexity, and its tools can make occupation-centered practice more sustainable by making the occupational therapy process that little bit simpler and a lot clearer. So, although the model does not dictate practice, it can inform practice. And those of us who have applied the MOHO know just how much it has helped us to sustain the evidence base of occupational assessments, the emotional appeal of personal narratives, and the credibility which comes from unifying our interventions. In my opinion, these persuasive techniques are vital when promoting occupation-centered practice, and adopting them can help occupational therapists to safeguard the sustainability of the profession. My take-home messages for managing complexity are: acknowledge the simplicity of the concept of occupational therapy, but promote the fundamental, that word again, importance of occupation. Celebrate the remarkable power of your profession to simplify things that matter for the people you work with. And remember that occupational models of practice have been designed to help you manage the complexity of professional reasoning. And my take-home messages for promoting sustainability of occupation-centered practice and convincing others of the fundamental worth of occupational therapy are: identify a range of occupational assessments if you are to be person-centered, which are theory-based, evidence-based, and clinically useful, and which can be used as outcome measures in your practice. Learn how to construct occupational narratives which are comprehensive and compelling, and why not try out the tick system when you negotiate measurable goals? And if possible, build your credibility and your evidence base by working together to implement packages of occupational interventions which are comprehensive and consistent. All that's left is for me to acknowledge just a few of the key people who have supported me. I wish it were possible to name everyone who deserves a mention. To share my references, which will pass by far too quickly for those of you who are watching the live event, but you will be able to pause the recording if you want to check them out later. And to say thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. What a wonderful lecture you've given us this afternoon. I am so pleased that I was able to join you. We have lots of questions, and I've been receiving lots of questions from the audience. So without further ado, we'll go into a period of questions and answers. And this evening, the first question is coming from Gemma. And Gemma asks, I've been reflecting on how to use MOHO in primary care to both reflect the needs of my clients whilst demonstrating value of occupational therapy to my colleagues. How do I do that?
Oh, gosh. I suppose I should say that my background is in acute mental health. And so I don't have all the experience, especially in the new ways of working in primary care. But when we were beginning to trial the model of human, I'm going to say the model of human occupation book, but the Maintaining Our Health Through Occupation handbook, we didn't actually get to trial it into primary care, but it was thought that that would be a really good area to try it out. In terms of other ways in which you can use MOHO, the obvious way is the assessments. That's where we start. And probably it would be more likely to be an assessment like the occupational circumstances assessment and interview rating scale, the OCARES, or sometimes people find it quicker to use the occupational self-assessment, which you can work alongside with the person doing, as long as you don't answer the questions for them. It can be really useful to work with them. So both those assessments are actually partly intervention as well. You'll see the light bulbs going on with people when you ask them about their occupational lives. So I can't recommend them highly enough.
Thank you, Sue. I'm going to sneak in my question first before I ask some of the others, because there's lots of questions in the chat. Okay. So in your talk, you talk about the simplicity in occupational therapy and our ability to simplify complexity for others.
Yes.
What actions do you want the audience to take away from today to build on this superpower? And how can we own it?
Oh, gosh. I suppose, I mean, all occupational therapists will know how our work helps to simplify the lives of people that we're working with, or that you're working with, because I'm no longer a practicing occupational therapist. And so I think everybody knows that. The thing is not to be embarrassed about it, that it feels like we're doing simple things with people, and to actually recognise that it's fantastic that we can make people's lives simpler. What we need to work on is making sure the team and those people who, you know, sort of commissioners, people like that, recognise that that takes a lot of effort on our part. And so we know that what we do is complex, but by using tools to evidence that, to demonstrate it, we can actually show part of our professional reasoning rather than the professional reasoning being locked away. I think that was my main takeaway.
That sounds fantastic to me, Sue. So our next question is from Karen, and Karen asks, Sue, what do you think are the ways that occupational therapists can and should do for adults with learning disabilities to ensure that we enable the person to participate in occupation in what is important and meaningful to them?
Okay, again, I have to say that although I supervised people, fantastic colleagues working in learning disabilities, it's never been my area of practice. When I worked with my colleagues most closely was when we were developing the MOHO Explore, the MOHO Exploratory Level Outcome Ratings, because it was a colleague of mine who recognised that the MOHO screening tool, wasn't actually sufficiently sensitive enough. And so she wanted something that actually had more of a focus on the environment, all the things that can be done in the environment to change things for people. And then working with John Cooper, who could see which bits of the MOHO we could use, which bits of the MOHO didn't fit. And it's a great starting place to think about assessing people's needs in learning disabilities. It's also been amazing to see people adapt recovery through activity and use it in learning disability services, something which I never anticipated. But there you go. Occupational therapists are fantastic at adapting things and simplifying them and making them available to the people they work with. Hope that answers the question.
So the next question is from another Karen, and she asks, the MOHO Explore is such a valuable tool in ensuring the environment is considered separately to the person. Yes. I have found it so impactful in ensuring that the person, those who are identified as having PMLD and moderate learning disabilities, how can this be used fully?
Sounds like you're using it, Karen. You know, it was designed for people with PMLD, profound learning disabilities. And so I think if I could add anything at all for anybody else who doesn't know how to use it, it would be to make sure that you use the assessment as a, it's best used when you are talking with everybody involved. So talking with anybody else who's working with a person and making sure you gather all that information. And at the same time, helping the people working with the individual understand the importance of all the different items that you're assessing and how they can make a difference for the person.
Thank you, Sue. So my next question is from Anne, and she asks, models of practice can often be challenging to apply to practice for new graduates. Do you have any advice when supporting newly qualified occupational therapists to use models?
I think there's so much information available, and that's what makes it difficult, actually getting used to the terminology and things. So one of the reasons why I was drawn to the MOHO is because it does have a stable of assessments. Again, that's where you start. And so choosing the right one. And for me, it was the OKs that opened my eyes to the MOHO. And when I had students, I used to say, practice asking the questions. You know, take it home, take to your family, take to your friends and ask them the questions. Get used to asking them, get used to rewording them. The better you are at understanding the questions, the more able you'll be to reorganize the interview, to follow the lead of the person that you're interviewing. I know that interview is quite a formal term. Try and make it more of a chat so that, you know, you can go backwards and forwards between the different elements. So take some assessments that are comprehensive, and that way that they will teach you about the model.
Okay. I've got another question here, and this one is from Pip. Pip says, thank you, Sue, for your clear messages and motivations, which are, as a true OT, many and varied. I wonder, please, whether what your most audacious value as an occupational therapist is.
Oh, my most audacious value. Okay. I suppose this links back to my thought that what I'm most proud of is actually putting something about protecting the environment into our conversations with the people we work with. It's just amazing seeing all the literature saying that we should be doing more. And yet so often sustainability in the eco sense of the word doesn't go beyond reduce, reuse, recycle. Whereas in actual fact, you know, it affects health and well-being. So I think that is quite brave of me to put it in there. It's definitely what occupational therapists are calling for. The World Federation of Occupational Therapists put together a fantastic paper. I think it was back in 2018. You know, we need to actually start having these conversations with people. I think that's pretty audacious.
Thank you, Sue. And the next question is from Rachel. She says, what brings you joy?
What brings me joy? Okay. What a lovely question. Working with occupational therapists, definitely. But actually, gardening is one of my big things, and quilting. I keep an allotment, which is actually my partner's allotment, but I help out. And yeah, it's really important to hold on to things that we know bring us joy in terms of the occupations that we pursue. So thank you for that question.
Okay. So there's another question from another Rachel, and she asks, how do you see the model of human occupation helping occupational therapists recognize and respond to structural health inequalities rather than focusing only on the individual?
Ooh. How do I think it will help combat structural health inequalities? In that case, I guess it comes back to the fact that it's not just working with an individual. When you document things, when you advocate for people, when you keep on communicating these things to the powers that be, it gives you a way in to begin to actually see that, you know, a lot of the issues affecting people today are not due of their own making. It's due to poverty. It's due to poor housing, and to engage in these conversations with your team leaders, with the managers, to actually not be afraid of speaking up and advocating for the people you work with. Not quite sure if that's answered it, but I think that's the best I can do.
That's okay, Sue. I just want you to know that there's lots of love being shared in the chat about your lecture. So
Thank you.
it's going down really,
So
really well.
nerve-wracking.
Don't be nervous, it's be fine. So there's a nice little question from Haley about pediatrics. So Haley said she works in children's services and she used MOHO theory, but would love to start to implement your intervention books. Are they suitable for young people?
I know that recovery through activity has been used in children, adolescent mental health services. I'm not quite sure about any children younger than that. But I mean, again, people have surprised me in how they have adapted it. People have used it in situations where I thought it might be possible. I thought it was very much in terms of the remotivation process, looking at people who are sort of like moving on from the exploratory level to the competence level. So those are terms used by Mary Riley: exploration, competence, achievement. And I kind of thought it was very much pitched there, but lots of people have used it entirely for exploratory purposes, just by doing a range of different activities and beginning to intersperse a few conversations with people, either the children themselves or the people working with them, about how this can help the individual. So that was my reason for writing the activity, to get those conversations started. But it's also just to have a range of activities. I think too often, it has been, in my experience, I've seen it happen where occupational therapists learn about particular activities that they think work really well. And if you work in a team of occupational therapists, that's great, because you can all take a different part. But if you really want to show and explore a range of activities with people, then recovery through activity looks at leisure activities, creative activities, physical activities, technological activities, outdoor activities, faith activities. It's my party piece, these. I should be able to reel them off, but 12 different sets of activities, rather than, you know, getting bogged down in standard ones that you found work well in your service. It pushes you to extend things.
Thank you, Sue.
Good luck.
So there's another question from R, and she says, Sue, amazing lecture, thank you. My question is, you've spoken about finding simplicity within complexity. From a practice development perspective, how can we support more experienced practitioners to adapt to the different developmental needs of early career colleagues, while also working in increasingly complex and resource-restrained environments?
Yes, so difficult. And the phrase simplicity in complexity came from Diane Cox, who actually said that she should have used it as her title, and maybe I should have used it as my title. It's absolutely great. I think it is definitely about working together to support each other. So I know when I was the practice development advisor for occupational therapists in Derbyshire Healthcare, NHS Mental Health Trust, that, you know, we had group supervision, which I was privileged to facilitate, with the Band 5 occupational therapists coming through, and we worked together so that we spent a year looking at assessments and putting together protocols, so that when new staff came in, there was a protocol there ready to follow. This is our key comprehensive assessment. These are the ones that we have access to. These are the ones that you could use. And then we spent a year looking at occupational formulation, and a year beginning to think about interventions. So, you know, it's just about pulling together to make sure that all the staff, all the occupational therapy staff in an area of practice, are pooling their ideas and putting a record together, so that new staff coming in can basically see what the expectations are and have the resources to move forward.
Okay, thank you, Sue. You'll be pleased to know that we only have time for 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. So one of the penultimate question is from Natalie, and she asks, would you agree in a nutshell that while we are experts in simplifying tasks for others, it takes skill, experience, and understanding of the complexity of our assessments and interventions to deliver in practice? Any comments you might have on this statement?
I absolutely agree. It's complex. Professional reasoning is complex, and learning how to follow this through in terms of our assessments and planning and intervention is complex. But I think, occupational therapy is a degree level profession. I don't think occupational therapists are put off by things like that. I think occupational therapists actually often pursue extra responsibilities and extra ideas. It just takes focus. And by having something that has been pre-prepared, I mean, the MOHO, for instance, I know that's my favourite model, my model of choice, but loads of different models, they're based on years of experience. So to take something that has been pre-prepared and has a resource linked to it does simplify things a great deal.
Thank you, Sue. So this is your final question. And for those who are still placing questions in the chat, Sue has committed to answering those for us, and we'll be posting them on the RCOT website at a later date. So I will now ask the final question. And Sue, it goes like this. And this one is from a lady called Celestial. What a lovely name. She says, from your experience, what is the biggest challenge occupational therapists face when simplifying complex situations, and how do you keep the focus on what really matters to the person?
Oh, to be person-centered means to be an active listener, to always negotiate. So your measurable goals can be negotiated step by step by step. Hold on to what they say they want and keep that at the heart of any measurable goals that you do negotiate. I've been very lucky to be gifted the new book. So I can show it, actually. I don't know whether it's back to front or not, but Kiel Hoffner's Conceptual Foundations of Practice, which has been edited by Gail Fisher and Jarrett Wolsker. And, all the models can work together. And there's some fantastic things that are coming out of the Canadian model of occupational participation about how to attend to a person, how to actually work with the person. Some really, really well-crafted, well-thought-through stages to work through. So I do recommend all models of practice, and what works for you, but what works for the person most of all.
So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Before we wrap up this afternoon's session, I just want to share two of my reflections with you. And I'm just repeating something because I did like the way that you broke it down for us. So you talked about the tick system. And for me, the example that you gave is going to be a valuable one that I'm sure everybody can adopt because it's so simple. So you explained that within the next week, which is the time frame, the T in the ticks.
Yes. It's
Sue
the last
Parkinson.
thing that it's the last thing that you think about, but it comes
Yes.
first to make sure that you're held to it.
Exactly. So the T, the time frame. Sue Parkinson, I, which is the individual, will reevaluate our experience of the change expected of giving the Elizabeth Casson Lecture, which is a key goal, with the love and support of our family. So you broke it down wonderfully, and thank you so much. I'm sure a lot of my OT colleagues will be able to go back and reflect on that. And then the other bit that I just wanted to sort of reflect on is that, when in your conclusion, you said, in conclusion, models of practice are not a substitute for professional reasoning.
No.
Professional reasoning is complex, but adopting a model of practice can help you to manage that complexity, and its tools can make occupational-centered practice more sustainable by making the occupational therapy process that little bit simpler and clearer. So those are my two takeaways from today's lecture, and I thank you so much for sharing that with us. So on behalf of, you're very welcome. So on behalf of RCOT, Sue, we will be sending you a special token. It's to acknowledge you joining the esteemed group of Elizabeth Casson Memorial Lecturers. And we will also be making a donation to a charity of your choice.
Thank you.
And just a little reminder for those who are watching that we'll be sharing the recording of Sue's lecture on our website. And it is now time for me to say thank you to all 1,880 of you who've joined us today. I do hope you've enjoyed our broadcast of the 2026 Elizabeth Casson Lecture. Thank you and good night.